In 1908, an Indian revolutionary who was born in Madras in India arrived at Marseille in France. Later, he traveled to Paris, London, Lisbon, New York, Germany, Russia, etc., with two objectives. Number one, unveiling the brutality of British colonialism in India, and number two, rejecting the idea of universalization of nation state. He made major contributions towards our understanding of the resistance to oppression, be it imperialist, authoritarian, totalitarian, fascist, racist, everything that is embodied by the nation state. We are talking about one of the most important anarchist activist and theoretician, M.P.T. Acharya. To talk to us about his life trajectory and many other important themes like anarchism and anti-colonialism, we have with us historian Ole Birk Laursen, who wrote the book Anarchy or Chaos, M.P.T. Acharya, and the Indian Struggle for Freedom.
Professor Ole Birk Laursen, thank you so much for accepting the invitation and coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure and honor. So thank you so much.
Professor, I want to start with this question. You're born in Denmark and you write a book about a completely forgotten figure of Indian freedom struggle who was actually born in Madras. So how did this happen? How did your academic evolution happen that you finally reached and got interested in the Indian anti-colonial movement?
It's a long journey, but I guess, as you mentioned, I was born in Denmark and grew up in a sort of working class family. And when I went to school, there were lots of other kids from Sri Lanka, Vietnam, Sudan, and I kind of just played with everyone. And but I realized there was a lot of racism at the time in Denmark, and I was looking to find out how this came about. And no one at that time really talked about sort of Danish colonialism or colonialism in Europe in general. And I had to look to Britain and to sort of, there was this emerging sort of post-colonial studies, discipline of post-colonial studies. And after sort of high school and university, I decided to try to pursue a PhD in sort of broadly speaking post-colonial studies. And alongside my PhD, I was working on a history project that focused on the history of South Asians in Britain from 1870 to 1940. And as part of that, I discovered these Indian anti-colonial revolutionaries who lived in London and at India House in London. And I was really fascinated by these figures because they were fighting from within the imperial center against the empire. And for me, that sort of connected to struggles of anti-racism that I found really relevant at the time. So I found it much more valuable to kind of look at these figures who fought against empire from within. And then I started looking at, as I said, these figures who lived at India House, and just became really fascinated by also the diversity of their political ideologies. And so that's very briefly my trajectory into studying this topic.
No, I want to further probe you. You said you're born in Danish working class, right? And you saw the racism around and you started looking into it, the literature. So what are your early readings and what are the figures which try to give the theoretical framework to your thoughts? Can you reflect on that?
I grew up in a working class house, and my parents didn't have books at home. So I was into my teens before I started reading literature, really. And I remember reading sort of working class literature, John Steinbeck and even Charles Dickens, And it kind of resonated with me, those kinds of stories, much more than I'd say many of the sort of Danish authors that we had to read in high school. That seemed like a different world. So it was through that kind of working class literature that I got into thinking more about hierarchies and struggles and sort of radical thought as well. So yeah, but it took a long time before I really actually started reading also post-colonial literature. I think some of the first authors I was looking at and became fascinated with was West Indian authors such as Sam Selvon and V.S. Naipaul and George Lamming, and these figures who'd come to Britain in the sort of early 1950s and also wrote a lot about the experiences of migration and exile and the racism they experienced there. So then I started discovering there was a body of sort of migrant literature that I found incredibly inspiring as well.
One thing that's surprising is you have engaged with a lot of English fiction, the post-colonial English fiction, the working class English fiction, but you shifted yourself to complete nonfiction. Is there something in you which still wants to go back to fiction writing?
I think I like combining that. What I often found when I sort of started looking academically at literature and fiction was it lacked the historical context. And so I often found that some literary analysis did not adequately capture historical context. And so I really wanted to go to the history and just get the solid grounding there. And from then we can sort of discuss literature in a different way. But I have a degree in literature, but I've also studied history. So I have an MA in history as well. So I like combining those two fields.
Now, getting back to your academic work, so you essentially, your work surrounds looking at international anti-colonialism, right? The transnational anti-colonial thought. So give us a gist about what is this international anti-colonialism and transnational anti-colonial thought that you're looking at, and why studying this becomes important now?
It's a very broad question. I think anti-colonialism has to be international. It's international in spirit. It might be nationalist in sort of in its ideology, but it is connected to an idea of internationalism. So I think it is necessary to look at those kinds of also transnational connections between, for instance, the Indians and the Egyptians, or the Irish, or the Russians who were in exile, or the North Africans, or the South Africans, and all of these sort of subject and colonial nations who went into exile and fought against empire from often within the imperial centers themselves. So I think it's that kind of international form of anti-colonial struggle that I'm really interested in. And I think it is incredibly relevant today at a time when fascism is on the rise again. The distortion of colonial history is really on the rise again. In India, the rise of the sort of Hindu nationalist far right is on the rise again. And I think my work is politically invested in trying to combat those ideologies that often go back in time and look at some of these figures that I'm looking at and then distorting their kind of ideology and history. And I'm trying to, in some ways, set the record straight and say, you cannot just look at these figures within the national context. You have to look at them internationally. So I think my work is invested in that kind of politics, and I think it is perhaps even more relevant today than ever. So I've often been told also that it is important to think about legacies and feeling that you have a history of struggling against fascism or colonialism. Whenever I talk to people who are more sort of involved in activism, that is often the feeling I get. It is really wonderful to have this kind of history to draw on. So I would like to think I make a small contribution in that way.
No, I'm sure yours is a very significant contribution, especially because you do not frame these various figures into single ideology. You appreciate their multiple ideas. Some are more looking at feminism, some are looking at nationalism, socialism, and you trace the trajectory of how they have played with various ideologies over time. But for the context of our conversation and the book that we are focusing on, you essentially focus on the idea of anarchism. Right? Can you explain what is this anarchism? Is it violent, non-violent? How is it related to socialism, communism, nationalism? So how does this work?
Oh, that's a broad question again, but I'll try. So, in my view, anarchism is a socialist idea. It is often also called libertarian socialism, so like a free form of socialism. And it is it's a sort of far left radical ideology that is often in opposition to more authoritarian forms of socialism. So it sort of emerges in the mid-19th century, and there are debates within the broader socialist movement between Karl Marx and Mikhail Bakunin about the kind of the ways in which socialism should develop. And whereas Karl Marx advocates the sort of two-stage system where the state has to come first, then the dictatorship of the proletariat, and then eventually the state will wither away, and then communism will flourish. Bakunin and the anarchists say, no, you cannot have the state, because then you centralize power and authority in one in one sort of fixed organization. You have to let people give people their freedom first, and then they can decide what kind of ideology they want to follow. So, and then there's those debates within the sort of broader socialist movement in the late 19th century, and there's the emergence of sort of social democrats, and then once Lenin sort of emerges onto the scene, there's the emergence of more sort of Bolshevik communist ideologies. And then there are the anarchists. And the anarchists are quite prominent, actually, globally speaking, particularly in South America and the West Indies, but also all over Europe and North America at the time. And they are, in essence, they are against, it means non-government, or the absence of government, the absence of governance, someone who is governing you, telling you what to do. Whereas the anarchists said, well, people are probably, capable of figuring out what to do themselves. And I think within sort of anti-colonial struggles, that idea should resonate more, actually. And I think for Acharya, that I'll come back to later, the idea that the rejection of colonialism should also be a rejection of the state, because it is the state that carries out this kind of colonialism. So the alternative to that would be the non-state, the absence of a state. And for anarchists, I think that kind of idea really resonated as well. But unfortunately, I think the idea of anarchism didn't resonate as much within many anti-colonial movements as you would have hoped, perhaps, for many reasons. But as I see it, so at the time that I'm looking at the early 20th century, then there's sort of the social democratic movement, which I call the socialist movement, and then there's also the kind of the more radical traditions coming from Russia in particular, that are the sort of communist traditions, and then there's the anarchist traditions. So yeah, those are kind of, broadly speaking, the differences between those ideologies.
So why were not many takers? Because it is essential. It is very interesting to think that anarchism, if I have understood correctly from what you said, it's once we give freedom and there should be no state, and people will decide how to conduct their business. And it is rejecting Marxist idea of in the face of socialism, we are going to have a state and then state will slowly withdraw. They clearly rejected the state at the very beginning. Am I correct in my understanding?
Yes, that's correct.
So why are there not many takers to this idea?
So within the anti-colonial movements in general, I mean, there are certainly people who, anti-colonial fighters in Ireland and South America in particular, who are attracted to these, to anarchist ideas. I think there's several things going on. I think, first of all, anarchism has a bad reputation at the time. So in the early 20th century, many of these Indian revolutionaries that I was looking at, they were called anarchists, but they were not politically or ideologically anarchists at all. They were, revolutionaries, they were terrorists, they were, fighting against them. So there's this distortion in the public mind of what anarchism meant. And I think that also spilled into then kind of a reluctance to embrace anarchist philosophy and ideology and the sort of political ideology of anarchism for many of these freedom fighters, because of this distortion of what anarchism was. So I think that is one reason why I think anarchism found less currency, particularly within the Indian anti-colonial context. And then I think later on, sort of after the Russian Revolution, I think, and the emergence of Gandhi, I think there's those two ideologies are much more dominant. So because of the Russian Revolution and the growth of the sort of Communist International, many freedom fighters are attracted to that kind of political ideology. And then sort of Gandhi's nonviolence movement in India in particular has a lot of overlaps with anarchist traditions and thoughts. And so I think instead of being sort of, being attracted to anarchism, people are just following Gandhism. And so I think in the Indian context, that is actually quite interesting. But there are differences, and I think Acharya is trying to grapple with these things in his sort of political development as well.
No, we will look at how Acharya has looked at down the line. But before that, the word anarchism, it has the word anarchy, and it essentially suggests violent, right? But was anarchism is promoting kind of violent way of removing the state?
Not necessarily. But I mean, so certainly, again, in the early 20th century, there were many instances of anarchists carrying out sort of violent terrorist assassinations or whatever. But so did many other sort of radical figures at the time. There were Russian social revolutionaries, there were Irish Fenians. They were also resorting to dynamiting and assassination. So it wasn't just that the anarchists were willing to resort to terrorism and violence. And actually, quite soon after, there's a little bit of a wave of assassinations of heads of states and kings and queens around the turn of the century. What is known as propaganda of the deed, where you show the people in power how dangerous it is for them to be in this position, and therefore they should just give it up, unless otherwise we will assassinate you. That's kind of the idea of the propaganda by the deed. But by and large, the anarchist movement at the time abandons that and rejects violent terrorism, actually, and is going completely in the other direction, and it becomes a much more anti-militarist and pacifist movement, which also involves a rejection of the state, because they see the state as being violent. That's where the states have a monopoly on violence. So to reject the state also means to reject violence, and anti-militarism is part of that tradition then. So I think within the anarchist movement, of course, there were people who celebrated violent terrorism, but the majority of anarchists at the time rejected that kind of violent terrorism. But again, the newspapers at the time probably found it much more interesting to write about as an assassination of a king or a president or whatever by an anarchist than these peaceful anarchists who just sat around and rejected the state. So it has a lot to do with propaganda in a way, also by the newspapers and the state.
That is very interesting what you have just said. I want to further probe you on this. In one of your works, you write about something called the contact zones. Cities like Paris, cities like London, who are actually imperial powers, but all the freedom fighters and the nationalists from various countries go and group there. And we're thinking about blowing up that very empire in which they are living in, which is very interesting. So can you explain us this idea of what is this contact zones and infrastructures? And it's genuinely fascinating to see how they thought that they can escape the surveillance within the imperial power rather than staying in the colony.
I mean, it's a really fascinating paradox that many of the Indians who came to London, for instance, or Paris, had much more freedom there to say what they wanted to say and do what they wanted to do. And they often talk about London. They refer to other sort of freedom fighters who went into exile and lived happily in London because that was considered the sort of the land of the free. So there was much more freedom in London, in Britain, than there was in the colonies. And it's that kind of paradox that is really fascinating as well. Obviously, then after some time, they in Britain in particular, they do realize that that there is many of the Indians who were in London at the time, around India House in particular, are becoming increasingly radicalized, and they start cracking down, and that then shifts the movement a little bit to Paris. There are other sort of contact zones again in Zurich, in Geneva, in Berlin. And I think in those European cities, they meet other freedom fighters in exile, whether that is Egyptians, Russians, or it's Irish people who've also been kind of forced into exile. And they all network, they all discuss how do we overthrow the oppressor, our respective oppressor, and so I think those cities are quite important, but even within those major European cities that I've been looking at in my research, there are particular neighborhoods that are actually, when you look at London, it's not all over London. It is particularly in around Shepherd's Bush in London. It's a very specific area where many of them live next door to each other. In Paris, they all live in the same arrondissement, which is this in sort of near the Moulin Rouge in London. Some of them live a bit, in Paris, and some of them live a bit further south, in very close proximity to many of the Russians who were in Paris at the time, and Lenin is there at the time. So, and in relation to some of the Polish people who were also in Paris at the time. So you live in these neighborhoods where when you walk down on the street, you would see the Russians, you would see the Egyptians, you would see the Irish. So, but they're confined to specific neighborhoods in these sort of cities. And so I think that is also important to highlight, that it is not just like this broad idea of London or Paris or Geneva. It's very particular spaces within those cities that are actually conducive to these kinds of conversations that you then have, where you do talk about overthrowing whatever oppressor that is oppressing you. And in Zurich and in Geneva, as I mentioned, one of Acharya's contemporaries, Ajit Singh, went there, and he was involved in like 3 different sort of anti-colonial groups One was for those who were oppressed by the British, and then there was one group that was for those who were oppressed by the French and the Russian empires, and I think there was another group as well. So you have these different sort of constellations of anti-colonial freedom fighters who meet up in various networks, and I find that incredibly interesting again to see those constellations.
Oh, that is interesting. They have multiple agendas themselves, but I think it will be wonderful, right? We're nationalists from Irish, Turkey, India, Russia walking into a tea shop, and they have one single objective: no exploitation of one man by another, which is very interesting to imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think those anti-colonial solidarities are incredibly important, actually, and it didn't necessarily mean that they just accepted the others and the kind of way that they fought. Many of the Indians often criticized the Egyptians for not being radical enough, and so they were saying, "Oh, you have to be much more radical. You actually have to sort of assassinate someone." But still, there was a lot of that feeling of solidarity against imperialism.
So how did these big nation states have allowed this? Like, is it the Paris, for example? We had M.N. Roy, we had Chato, Virendra Chattopadhyay, we had Baikaji Kama, we have M.P.T. Acharya. Was the state aware of all this? The French state aware of all this, that these various anti-national activities are going on within it?
I can only speculate. My feeling is that because for instance, the Indians in Paris were not interested in overthrowing the French Empire, so the French kind of left them alone. And then there was this rivalry also between the British and the French at the time. So the French were not necessarily interested in helping the British with throwing out these Indians who were there. That does happen a bit later on, and especially then during the First World War. Because that's when the British and the French become allies, and that really shifts the political climate there at the time. But I think in many cases, the freedom fighters who went into exile in these places, they stayed for as long as they could, and the state allowed them to stay because they were not against, in Switzerland, they were not against the Swiss state or anything. Again, as I said, that changed with the outbreak of the First World War. I think in Paris, at the time, we're talking early 20th century, there were lots of Russians, and they were kept under much more strict surveillance than many of the Indians, which was a much smaller group anyway, and the Egyptians. So the Russian Tsar had sent his own secret police to operate in Paris at the time, which was not allowed officially, but the French state said, "Yeah, you can do this, so we don't have to do it," basically. But they said there were 25,000 Russians in Paris at the time, out of which they considered 1,500 of them to be revolutionaries. And so they kept all of these 1,500 individuals under strict surveillance. So I think they were a little bit more concerned with the Russians than with the Indians or the Egyptians or the Turkish or the Chinese.
No, that also speaks to the kind of surveillance system the state have. If they're keeping 15,000 under surveillance, I mean, the state is extraordinary.
Yeah. The Russian Empire was really mighty at the time. Yeah.
Okay, now let's actually talk about your research process, right? So you're currently focusing on, your current focus is on the Indian anti-colonial movement. So how does the process go? How do you dig the archives, oral histories, and what kind of challenges do you face in your work?
So when I started looking into M.P.T. Acharya, I had read Maya Ramnath's work, and she mentioned that he was sort of involved in the anarchist movement. And I read the files that are held in the India Office records in the British Library, and there's some hints that he was involved in the anarchist movement, but not a lot. But I was interested in finding out how much he was involved, and so I started digging. The problem that I had in the beginning was locating the archives, because he traveled all over the world. And that means the archives are scattered all over the world. There's some in India, but there's also a lot in Europe, and there's some in North America, and there's some in Russia. So it became really difficult to locate these archives even. There's not a set of M.P.T. Acharya papers anywhere. There's not like a set of, yeah, this is where you go. So I think that was one of the challenges I really faced with this, just locating the archives. But once I started looking into him in particular, I started finding, first of all, many of the texts that he had written. And they were usually, I would say, half of them are in English, and then they were published in German, French, Spanish, Italian, Japanese. And I don't master all of those languages, so it's been really difficult to translate that. So I started finding a lot of his writings in archives all over the world, and many libraries are now digitizing periodicals and papers, so that has helped a lot. But then the question of language really plays into it as well, because as I said, I don't master all of those languages. I can sort of speak it a little bit, some of these languages. So that really became a challenge to actually, just understand what is in there. The things that really opened up the research was the correspondence I found between him and some of the other anarchist figures in the movement. And some of the first correspondence I found was between M.P.T. Acharya and Tom Keel, who was the editor of the anarchist paper Freedom in London. And then I found his correspondence with a figure named Boris Yelensky, Russian-American anarchist who lived in Chicago in the I think he moved there in the 1920s, but it was in the 1940s that they had correspondence. And then I found his correspondence with a French anarchist called E. Armand. And in a lot of his correspondence, he writes about who he knows. He writes about where he has been and what he's doing next and what he has published. So he would write all this sort of personal information, he would give all this personal information, and that enabled me to follow those leads then. Often it's led me down a blind alley, basically. I just couldn't, many of these figures that he mentions are completely unknown today, and it's impossible to find out more. But I did find enough material to actually piece together enough of a history. And then I'm based in Berlin at the moment, and because Acharya lived in Berlin for 12 years, there's actually quite a lot of files on him here. Hundreds and hundreds of pages where the German state kind of keep him under surveillance as well, but he also has correspondence with the German Foreign Office, particularly about getting a passport to leave Germany. So once I started finding, first of all, the texts that he wrote, then the correspondence that he had, and then more sort of official documents from government authorities, I was able to piece together this much bigger story. But obviously there are many gaps and many leads I really couldn't pursue in full. But yeah, that is the story.
No, one more thing I want to probe you on is I'm sure the challenge you would have faced is also the pseudonyms, right? You write in your book that one of his pseudonym was Marco Polo.
Yes.
How did that happen?
I don't know when I think it's after the Second World War, he assumes that. And I'm not quite sure why. Maybe it refers to being a world traveler. He never says, but he actually says that I am writing under the pseudonym now. And obviously it wasn't unusual for revolutionaries of all nations to travel under pseudonyms. I mean, yeah, M.N. Roy is not his real name either. So it's not an unusual tradition per se. I think maybe it allowed him to hide a little bit some of the more radical things that he was writing, and he couldn't be prosecuted for it. But it means, yeah, again, the process of researching someone's pseudonym is quite difficult. And I would say in particular with Marco Polo, because once you do start searching for Marco Polo, it is not M.P.T. Acharya who comes up, it is Marco Polo. So that posed some challenges, but I could sort of often make, I would say, a qualified guess that this was actually Acharya and not the other Marco Polo when I came across that. So but then it's also a matter of there are various misspellings of his name, and even he changes from being M Acharya to M.P.T. Acharya. So even that makes it really difficult at some point to like, who is this really, and how do you find information? So, for instance, when I found when he left Istanbul in July 1912 and went to the United States, I knew which ship he arrived on and on what date. So, and there's a database of all passengers who arrive into New York, and you can sort of go into this database and search for someone there. But he didn't travel under that name, or they had misspelled it, and he had a Persian passport. So this is suddenly really difficult to find this person. So I had to go through a long, long passenger list to find a name that, oh, this is probably M.P.T. Acharya, actually. That's just one instance of him, yeah, it being difficult to find him in the archives. Yeah.
Okay, and now getting into your book, we talked about many things around it. How did you arrive at M.P.T. Acharya, and why M.P.T. Acharya that you choose to write about out of the whole host of characters that you have come across?
I mean, as I said before, I became interested in, I had sort of been interested in anarchist history prior to this, and been slightly involved in some sort of radical organizations at the time, and I was really interested in anarchism. So he was a figure who was called an anarchist by the British authorities at the time, but he wasn't an anarchist. But later became an anarchist. I read that, and so I thought, okay, here's a really unique story then. Let me see how much of an anarchist he is, and how much he was involved with the anarchist movement from the 1920s onwards. It was that kind of uniqueness, and I felt after some time that there was enough of a story as well. It wasn't like he disappeared in the 1920s. He was active right up until his death, actually, and mostly writing, but and so not like a political activist, but he is writing about anarchism. And once I think I've located more than 200 of his texts and essays that continue right up until he dies in March 1954. And so that allowed me also to tell a longer story that starts sort of really in the early 20th century, but then continues for about 50 years through some of these major events in world history, right from the kind of early anti-colonial movement in India, but then also the sort of events that are happening in Europe and in the Ottoman Empire and the United States and the Russian Revolution and the rise of Nazism and fascism, and how do you escape that? And then the Second World War and Indian independence and into the Cold War. So there's a lot of global events that I could tell through writing about Acharya because he was active for so long. So that also really interested me, actually. And it also made it really difficult to write about this, actually, I would say. It was a big story to keep track of.
No, I can find that challenge you have picked up, because in your book, I see how you try to pack so much into each chapter, each phase of his life. But let's start with the beginning phase. Tell us something about M.P.T. Acharya's early beginning. How did he look up to revolutionary activity and decide to leave India?
So I don't know that much about his really early life, but he seems to become involved in revolutionary activity at a quite early age, in his sort of late teens. So I think around 1906, he's involved in a revolutionary newspaper. And in 1907, he starts working with his cousin on another revolutionary paper called India. And he becomes the, I think, editor and proprietor of that paper after his cousin is sent to prison. Because obviously, like we talked about earlier, the paradox of Britain versus India is you could not publish sort of anti-colonial revolutionary literature in India at the time. You could in Britain, but you could not in India. So he realizes that he needs to go into exile. And first they kind of move the paper to Pondicherry, which is a French territory, and they were thinking they would be outside of British jurisdiction. But it becomes apparent quite quickly that even the French there are collaborating with the British. So he realizes that he has to escape. He has to leave India altogether. And I think he goes to Colombo and decides he wants to actually go to Japan, but there's no ship to Japan. So he jumps on the first ship that then takes him to Europe. And he arrives in Marseille in France, which is sort of the usual port of entry. For many of the ships that came from India at the time, they would go to Marseille and then often to Southampton later on. But so he disembarks in Marseille and then goes to Paris. He's there for a week, seeks out some of the other Indian revolutionaries who were there at the time, but realizes he can't stay. And then he goes to London, where he knows some of the people who are there, and they take him in, and he is brought to India House, which was this hostel for Indian students in North London. That at that time, this is November 1908, had become really what he says a hotbed for sedition mongers, as he calls them. So he becomes involved in India House. He lives there for free. And meets many of the most radical Indian revolutionaries who are in exile in London at the time.
While he is active in the India House in London, but I want to take a moment, step back, and talk to you something about something that's happening in North America, which is the Ghadar Party. Right? Can you tell us something about the Ghadar Party and the kind of influence it had on the revolutionaries?
So the Ghadar Party is started by actually Acharya's friend Lala Hardayal in May 1913. So it's a little bit later. But Hardayal has also spent time at India House. At least he visits it. I'm not sure if he actually lives there, but he lives in London at the time. And then he moves to Paris, and then he goes into this journey all over the world. And he ends up in the US in 1912, and then goes to California in 1913, and sort of reorganizes an already existing group of Indian revolutionaries into what is known then it becomes known as the Ghadar Party, named after its paper that it brings out, which is called Ghadar Mutiny. And what is unique about the Ghadar Party is that it replicates many of the other groups that already existed. There was the India House in London, there's an India House in Tokyo, there's the Paris Indian Society, and it's sort of modeled on the like similar lines. But what is unique about the Ghadar Party is there's a much bigger group of Indian laborers who are working in the lumber mills in California and fruit pickers, and who are workers there. And so it becomes a much bigger movement, whereas in many of the other places in Europe and in Japan, it was mostly intellectuals, students who had gone into exile and then become involved in radical activity. The Ghadar Party is kind of led by some of these more intellectual students, but it has a broader mass appeal, and it brings in many, many more Indians at the time. So this is May 1913, and set up by Lala Hardayal, and then the Ghadar Party really connects with Indians all over North America, but also South America and elsewhere, actually. I think there are groups even in East Africa, there are groups in Indonesia, and so that really becomes a global movement. And then Acharya goes to North America in July 1912. He's on the East Coast, and the Gada Party is mainly on the West Coast. But somehow he reconnects with Hardayal again, and as far as I know, he offers to translate the paper into Tamil, and he becomes briefly involved with the Gada Party like that. So yeah, but this is a global Indian anti-colonial movement at the time.
No, now I would like to look at the dilemmas which these international revolutionaries were facing. They, for example, if we take M.P.T. Acharya, he's trying to oppose the British colonialism, and they are looking at the global anti-colonialism. But at the same time, they are trying to find themselves shelter within some colonial power. Right, I'm sure there were a lot of dilemmas. One immediate dilemma that has come to my mind while I was discussing with you, and which I discussed with Sam Dalrymple in my earlier podcast, is the case of Subhash Chandra Bose. Subhash Chandra Bose had to make a choice between the British imperialism and the German fascism and Nazism. And I'm sure there are so many of these dilemmas. So what dilemmas did M.P.T. Acharya face, and what kind of resolution they had on these?
I mean, there's some, in some ways, similar to that debate with Subhash Chandra Bose, but obviously it's an earlier period. But it is thinking about, obviously there were these sort of anti-colonial alliances with the Egyptians and the Irish and the many other subject nations in exile. And then, because you are operating within Europe, in M.P.T. Acharya's case, they were trying to find allies with European socialists in particular, and Marxist communists and anarchists at the time. But there's still this kind of dilemma between, they are still from the sort of European imperial centers, and how much can we count on their support? And that kind of became evident in several cases already from so already from 1907, I think there are some of the Indians who attend the International Socialist Congress in Stuttgart 1907. They attend the International Socialist Congress in Copenhagen in 1910. And then Acharya and Chatto go to Sweden in 1917 to find allies with the international socialists who are gathered there for this sort of peace congress, because they see the question of freedom is tied to socialism. But many of the European socialists did not necessarily see it like that. So I think they often face that dilemma of how much do we ally ourselves with these European socialists? How willing are they to help us in our fight against basically, the British Empire? And then the outbreak of the First World War really changes the alliances again, and suddenly there's the opportunity for them to ally themselves with the Germans, who are against the British, and allied with the Ottoman Empire, that are then also against that are allied with the Germans then. So now they actually have a huge European nation helping them in their fight against the British and the French in some ways also. But it is a little bit of a dilemma again, because how much can they rely on the Germans to help them? And also, does that mean then, if the Germans defeat the British, will India then become a German colony? And I think Acharya and Chatto are discussing this quite a bit, actually, and they are quite well aware that, okay, maybe liberating ourselves from Britain means we will become a German colony, but that is then something we have to deal with afterwards. But it's a really difficult conversation to have, actually, and I think Acharya learns from that experience that he does not want to subject the Indian freedom struggle to another nation state to another German power or a Russian state. So I think he really wants to maintain his freedom to avoid that kind of dilemma again.
No, because you have talked about the second international Stuttgart that happened. And one more key event that happened in that summit was Baikaji Kama, another Indian from Bombay and living in Paris, unfurling the Indian national flag, right? And that's a very significant event. So let's focus on Kama for a moment. Kama, if you look at her life, have essentially troubled with two ideas of anti-colonialism and feminism, right? So how did she relate these two issues, the feminism and the anti-colonialism and the women's question?
It's a really interesting question, and she is a really interesting figure who I don't think anyone has really been able to capture yet. I know there's a biography being written about her at the moment, and I've done some research on her as well. So she was involved, as you said, both in the sort of international feminist movement at the time. She attended several sort of feminist congresses in Paris at the time. I think the first instance I've found is from 1906. I think she's involved in another congress in 1912 and 13. And she actually, I also discovered this, she actually goes to the International Socialist Congress in Copenhagen in 1910 as well. And attends the separate feminist women's international socialist meeting there, which was where it was decided to have an International Women's Day, actually. So she's present at that meeting as well. As far as I can tell, because I've read about this in the Danish newspapers, but I haven't really discovered this anywhere else. So I'm a little bit unsure whether or not she's actually there, but the Danish newspapers say that she is there. So she is involved in both the sort of early feminist movement at the time, but she says that for her, the question of Indian freedom is greater than the question of women's rights. She goes on a tour of the United States in late 1907 into early 1908, and she gives some interviews, and she's asked about this question, what she finds most important. And she says, give us freedom first, then we will deal with the women's question. So I think for her, the sort of anti-colonial movement was the most important thing, and then the question of women's rights and freedom was second. But she was heavily involved in many of these feminist movements, and she often also challenged. When she attended the Egyptian National Congress in Brussels in 1910 as well, and she challenged the Egyptians. Where are the women? Where's the other half of your population? So she really wanted women to be part of the freedom movement, and I think that's a really incredibly important statement she actually makes there. But she is a really unique figure that is at the heart, I think, of many anti-colonial networks in Paris in the early 20th century. She is close friends with Irish, Egyptians, Japanese, Chinese, Russians, Polish. All of these people, they come to her, and she attends all these meetings as well, and she gives talks around Paris. The full scope of her network, I think no one's really been able to uncover that yet. I would love to do it, but I simply don't have the capacity to do it. But she's a really key figure. And what is also interesting, if just want to briefly say, I think the Indian anti-colonial movement in Europe at the time is mostly a male movement. Aside from Madame Karma, there's a couple of Dadabhai Naoroji's granddaughters are involved, and I think one of Chatto's sisters is slightly involved, but it is mostly men. But there's never any sense of these men sort of belittling or talking down to Madame Karma because she's a woman. There's a tremendous amount of respect around her. So I think she's an incredibly important figure that unfortunately we don't know enough about, to be honest. We really don't.
That's very unfortunate. But I mean, we have recently had a book by Nico Slate, the biography of Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, who actually went to US to talk against racism within the United States and found a solidarity between colored women. I think there's a lot of scope in this line. Now, I want to take it a little further and probe you into this question about the founding of the Indian Communist Party. Fascinatingly, Indian Communist Party was not founded in India. Tell us the story.
So it's a complicated story, and I'll try to sum it up. So after the Russian Revolution, and a couple of years after that, in 1919, M.P.T. Acharya goes to Russia with a small group, and they meet Lenin in July 1919. They travel on to Kabul in Afghanistan, and there set up the Indian Revolutionary Association, which is a mixed group of nationalists, maybe some communists, some anarchists, pan-Islamists. So it's a really sort of just a motley group of Indians who are against the British Empire. It is not affiliated with the Communist International at the time. In July 1920, the Second Congress of the Communist International meets in Moscow and Petrograd, so St. Petersburg. And Acharya is invited as a delegate of the Indian Revolutionary Association. At the same time, M.N. Roy is also making his way to Russia. He is in exile in Mexico and has been one of the co-founders of one of the Mexican communist parties. There were several sort of Mexican communist parties at the time, and he founded one of them. And he, I think at the time, has become more of a orthodox communist. But he's brought in to represent the Mexican Communist Party. At the same time, Abani Mukherjee has arrived in Amsterdam, brought in by a Dutch communist, and is also making his way to Moscow. And he's actually listed as an Indian communist, as the only Indian communist. And then there's Muhammad Shafiq, who is a representative of the provisional government of India in exile in Kabul as well, I think. And so you have four Indians representing kind of four different strands of exiled Indian revolutionary groups. And none of them are sort of committed communists at the time. But they all go to the Second Congress of the Communist International in Moscow. And I think both Mukherjee and M.N. Roy and M.P.T. Acharya sort of become convinced by Lenin's commitment to liberating the supporting anti-colonial struggles in the East. And subsequent to the Second Congress of the Communist International in October 1920, they meet up in Tashkent and hold the first meeting of the Indian Communist Party. And then it takes a few months for them to actually sort of affiliate with the Communist International, become like an official Indian Communist Party. So by the time that only happens into like December 1920, so 2 months after they've had their first meeting. And by then, M.N. Roy has really taken power of this new group, and he wants everyone to submit themselves to the ideology of Leninism. Communism has become Leninism at the time. Whereas Acharya at this point is much more of a free spirit and probably much more of an anarchist, and does not, again, want to submit the Indian freedom struggle to another statist ideology, basically, because he's done that before. He's seen how he cannot rely on these European states anyway. So there's the debate between the two of them by December 1920, late December, becomes really difficult. And Acharya starts, I think, saying negative things about Roy, and I think Roy says really negative things about Acharya, and it becomes like a personal issue as well. And then eventually Acharya is expelled from the Indian Communist Party, I think on the New Year's Eve 1920. But then after that, I mean, M.N. Roy really takes hold of the Indian Communist Party, and becomes sort of a trusted man of Lenin. And that whole story you've heard from Kavita Rao, who spoke eloquently about it. But it means that Acharya is he's a dissident revolutionary in Moscow in 1921. And that's a dangerous position to be in if you do not sort of follow the Communist Party. Then it might be difficult for you to stay in Moscow. And certainly when he sort of by then actually become much more of an anarchist. So he has to flee Russia again, and he manages to escape in November 1922. And then the thing about the Indian Communist Party is that it is not the Communist Party of India, it is the Indian Communist Party that they set up. And it is not really acknowledged as the first Communist Party of India, also because it was established outside of India. And so there are all these debates then about who are the real communists here. And but that's a different complicated story that I don't have a full overview of that. So yeah.
That is quite interesting. In Lenin's Russia, it is tough to live if you are not a communist. And in Stalin's Russia, it's even tough to live if you are a communist. We have several leaders, including one of India's revolutionary, Virendranath Chattopadhyaya, who disappeared during his Great Purge, about whose death we don't have all the details yet. I have discussed about it in an earlier podcast with Kavita Rao.
So now I would like to take a stock on how did Acharya, among all his travels across the world after he left India and before he comes back to India, how is he viewing the Indian national movement that's happening within India? What are his views on various key figures, and especially Mr. Savarkar and Mr. Gandhi?
So it's quite interesting. So in the 1920s, I said he's traveled all over the world, but now he's sort of in Berlin for 12 years in the 1920s. And things are really happening in India at the time, obviously. But I think many of the Indians, that also includes Chatto and various other people, they are stuck in Berlin, and they don't necessarily have a lot of information about what is going on in India. They're a little bit separated from everything, except from what they read in the newspapers, obviously. So I don't think they have full grasp of what is going on. I think they did, but clearly it seems as if they didn't quite know. But the two major figures that you're talking about, Savarkar and Gandhi in particular, I think obviously Acharya knew Savarkar from London, from India House. They had worked together for about 7-8 months, which is not a long time, but enough to actually, get to know each other. My sense is, because Acharya doesn't write about Savarkar in the 1920s, he seems to be a little bit of an obscure figure for these Indians who were in exile. They never mention him in the 1920s. When Acharya returns to India in 1935, he starts writing up his memoirs, and he writes these little essays about figures he knew. So he writes quite a lot about Chatto, actually, and they after Chatto was disappeared by Stalin, he writes about Walter Strickland, and then he writes about Savarkar. And this is, I think, 1938, so it's quite a bit later on. And he really admires Savarkar for his courage, and he was in prison for many years. He admires him for his intellect and his articulation of anti-colonialism at the time. It's sort of a nostalgic view of Savarkar. And so there's that, and I think that's from 1938. And then he writes again about Savarkar in, I think, 1948, after Gandhi's assassination, and he revises his opinion about Savarkar, and he says Savarkar's lost his mind while he was in prison, and that Savarkar's kind of stuck in the past. He doesn't have a grasp of what is going on now, and it's a shame he didn't ally himself with the International Congress. But he says he's wasted his time and he's wasted his mind. So he becomes quite critical of Savarkar, but it is going from this kind of admiration of Savarkar early on to becoming much more critical. I know Chatto also actually spoke admiringly of Savarkar in the 1920s, but he's not, in my opinion, he's not an important figure for many of these Indians who were in exile. Gandhi is a much more important figure for them. And in particular, Gandhi's sort of civil disobedience campaign and nonviolence movement really resonates with Acharya in particular, because it so closely aligns with the anarchist principles that he is advocating at the time, whether it's sort of building villages, communes. It is also Gandhi's tactics of defying the state. I think the Salt March in 1930 in particular is a huge moment for Acharya. He really feels that this is Gandhi showing himself to be an anarchist tactician, he says, of the greatest magnitude or something. He does not like the cult around Gandhi. He doesn't call himself a Gandhian at all. He admires Gandhi's tactics and his political philosophy, but he also criticizes Gandhi for aligning himself with the Indian National Congress briefly, and for not rejecting the state in like a complete rejection of the state. But he kind of shifts his attitude, and I think later on, so this is already in the 1920s, but he writes quite a lot about Gandhi also in the 1930s and then in the 1940s, and even then after Gandhi is assassinated, he complains about the cult of Gandhi again, but really then starts admiring Gandhi's principles, and also Gandhi's sort of the inheritor of Gandhi, Vinoba Bhave, he calls him a saint. He's much more of a saint, and so I think he shifts his opinion of Gandhi and the Gandhi's tactics and becomes a great admirer of Gandhi. He writes to him, I think in 1931 or something, and is basically asking for help to escape Nazi Germany, or what he can see, this sort of emerging Nazism in Germany. He wants help to leave, and Gandhi never replies. So he writes another letter where he says he's really angry with Gandhi for not responding to him. But I think that's the only correspondence that they had, actually. So I think on a personal level, he didn't like him, but he really admired his tactics.
No, even Gandhi writes 2 letters to Hitler for which he will never get a response. That's very interesting. So once he is back in India and he lived few years into the Indian independence, so how did he see the idea of anarchism in the post-colonial Indian context, right? In the pre-colonial, you want to get rid of the British and the state, but now the British has left. Now anarchism without anti-colonialism. So how did you look at anarchism in the post-colonial context?
I mean, it's really interesting, actually, because for him, he felt that even after independence, nothing had changed. It was just a change of masters into the hands of the Indian elite, into the hands of Rajendra Prasad and Nehru, and they were exploiting the masses and the workers in the same ways that the British did. So, I mean, because for him, it was a criticism of the idea of the nation state. he saw it as a wasted opportunity to not then, after independence, follow sort of the Gandhian model and have villages that were federated into a different form of society, rather than conglomerating everything into an independent nation state again. So he remained incredibly critical of the new post-colonial Indian state, and also incredibly critical of some of the early leaders who he felt had abandoned all of their promises to the people, and their promises to the commitment of non-violence, and the former Gandhians who completely abandoned that now and said we need to build up a strong military. So he really criticized a lot of these new leaders that were emerging, and he saw that this is going to happen when you come into power. So for him, it was a matter of criticizing, also holding people accountable. So I said for him, the new independent Indian nation state, it really didn't change much. It was just a continuation of, hierarchy and masters and servants. So
give us a picture of the person, the M.P.T. Acharya, throughout this whole trajectory. How was he as an individual?
It's a really interesting question that's often occupied me, and I've been trying to find those personal details actually, which I love actually, because it's a human story. My impression is, I remember reading after he died, one of the German anarchists wrote an obituary to him in Sweden, actually. And he says he was always in a good mood when he came into the office of this German anarchist newspaper. And it sounds like he was incredibly sarcastic as well. I sense that in some of his writing, it is a sarcastic tone. He seems to have been a little bit of an isolated figure in Berlin, because he remained such a staunch, principled anarchist that sometimes he wouldn't compromise with that, and that maybe left him a little bit isolated here. But he would still meet up with many of the other Indians who were in Berlin at the time. He loved cats, and Bombay, they had lots and lots of cats apparently. And I think I've read two accounts of this, of their friends coming to visit him and his wife, and I'll talk about her as well. And they had to step over the cat to get into the house, actually. He loved cats. And then he was ill throughout his life from very early on. So he suffered from really poor health. And I think that affected him greatly as well. He was often on the verge of starvation, even in the 1910s. So when he's in his 20s, so when he gets into his 40s and 50s, he's struggling, with his health. And I think in the last 5 years, he's almost confined to his bed. But his wife is also incredibly important, and there's a biography of her written by Lena Bernstein. His wife is Magda Nachman, and they meet in Russia at some point, probably in 1921. We don't know yet. They go to Berlin together, and she's of German descent, but is a Russian subject. And she's an artist, and she travels in all the sort of artist circles in Berlin at the time. Again, I don't think we have a full grasp of her connections, but she's certainly connected to a lot of the Russian artists who are also in exile. And then when they go to Bombay in 1935, she stays behind with her sister in Zurich in Switzerland, and he travels alone because he's afraid if he goes into jail, then what is going to happen to her. Once he feels he's safe in Bombay, she joins him about a year, maybe a year and a half later, and she then builds up a network amongst the artists in India, really, and starts exhibiting a lot. And I think she's the main breadwinner amongst the two of them in India at the time. But they're struggling, really struggling. I often read in letters that they don't know how they will survive the next couple of months because they have no money. I think ironically, Magda Nachman's paintings are now actually incredibly. They're selling. I remember reading recently that one of her paintings sold for £250,000, which is a lot of money. So I think by now she's becoming sort of a recognized artist, but at the time she was struggling and they were struggling a lot. But as a person, like I said, I have very few impressions of this, but the few impressions I have is that he seems like a really wonderful guy, actually, and very friendly and sort of sarcastic. But it's hard to get that out of the sources sometimes.
What was he like on his deathbed? What are his final thoughts, the final regrets, or the moments of happiness at his final moments?
I mean, I think as I said, he keeps writing right up until, I mean, I think even up, so he dies in March 1954, and his last article is published in April 1954. So even after he's died, they didn't realize that he died, so they just published it anyway. He, as I said, he's in incredibly poor health, and he's well aware of it. He's in the last year or so, he talks a lot about how he's going to die. He knows he's going to die. And I think he has a brother who comes to visit him, who he hasn't seen for 30 years or 40 years even. But he feels he's very much alone. And he dies kind of alone. He goes to the hospital in mid-March 1954 and then dies there a few days later. I think it says in one of the obituaries I read there were friends with him when he died, but I don't know who they were. His writings right up until the last correspondence I have is from 1953, so about 9 months before he dies, and he talks a lot about that he is probably going to die. But in his sort of political writing, he remains fierce as ever, right up until his last month, basically. I sometimes wish I could sit down with him in those final days, in the final moments, and ask him questions about many things that I still need to figure out, but also asking him what his legacy would be and what he would like to pass on. Because I lived with him for 10 years almost. I feel like I really got into him, and I would like to have the possibility of sitting down with him and asking him questions, but someone else probably did it back in the day.
It's extraordinary to look at this complete life trajectory of M.P.T. Acharya, the complete selfless lives he have lived, and his contributions to the global anti-colonial thought. I think it becomes extremely relevant, especially in the world right now, which is becoming more parochial and provincial. It was great to hear about his complete life trajectory.
So, Laursen, when is the next book coming and what is it about?
So there's two projects I'm working on at the moment. I'm literally just finishing up another book entitled The Indian Revolutionary Movement in Europe from 1905 to 1918. And that is sort of a broader history of many of Acharya's in there, but it's many of his contemporaries. It's Chatto, it's Lala Hardayal, it's Madame Karma, it's Savarkar, it's Shyamji Krishnavarma. And it moves across Europe. So from Britain to France to Switzerland, into Belgium, into Denmark, into Sweden, into Norway, into Italy. So that it's a much broader history, but it's a much shorter period of time. and it ends with the end of the First World War. So that is one book that I'm literally now just wrapping up. I'm revising the manuscript at the moment. And then there's another figure that I've become really interested in, who is Narayan Krishna, who attended the International Socialist Congress in Copenhagen in 1910, alongside Madame Karma and VVS Iyer, who was a close friend of Acharya as well. And Narayan Krishna is slightly older than Acharya. He's from 1875 and had traveled, again, all over the world, and went to Russia in 1903 and met Tolstoy. Probably the only Indian to actually go and visit Tolstoy in Tolstoy's home in 1903. Then he traveled to Finland, Sweden, Denmark, and he goes to Canada and then the US in 1905, and travels all over the United States, and then comes back to Europe in 1908, travels all over Europe, and then he lives in Denmark for about 2 years between 1909 and 1912. He travels all over Denmark, gives lectures wherever he could. He goes to my hometown, which is a small town in the middle of nowhere, but he is there. He meets all the biggest socialists in the Second International Socialists at the time. He writes to Karl Kautsky. He meets Edward Bernstein. He knows everyone. He becomes quite a celebrity, actually, in Denmark at least. They describe him as a celebrity. And then when the First World War breaks out, he returns to the US and again travels all over the US, and he kind of abandons the political arena, becomes more of a person of like involved in cultural activities, but continues being active into the 1920s and 30s. And so I'm right now tracing his life as well, because it's an incredibly fascinating figure as well. And so I enjoy writing these biographies of these obscure figures who've gone into exile and travel all over the world. And so that's my next project. But yeah, and then I should, one thing about Acharya actually I should mention. So one thing that really annoyed me was that he was writing his memoirs, and he started writing them already in the mid 1930s, and only part of it was published in the late 1930s, and then again in book form in, I think, 1991. So, but there's a manuscript somewhere, and a friend of mine has traced a few pages from that manuscript in an archive in Mumbai, actually, but we don't know where the rest is. So we're trying to find the rest of that manuscript of Acharya's memoirs. And if I manage to get hold of it, I would try to publish it somehow and make it available for everyone.
Then we will get an updated version of this book, Anarchy and Chaos.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Ole Birk Laursen, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for this. This is really a fantastic opportunity to talk about this. Thank you so much.
Thank you.